Released by Square Enix in 2007 on the PlayStation Portable, director Hajime Tabata and writer Kazushika Nojima worked together to create a prequel to Final Fantasy VII for its 10th anniversary. The game sets up the world and role of many characters from the main game, and focuses on developing several figures such as Zack, Aerith, Sephiroth, and key members of Shinra. The story and gameplay are done solely from the perspective of Zack, and features full voice acting. For combat, random encounters are utilized while actual combat is similar to the Kingdom Hearts menu-based real-time system. Mechanics such as the equipment and materia system have been majorly overhauled and removed to reduce player micromanagement, and instead contribute to the main battle modifier, the Digital Mind Wave. The DMW is a continuously spinning slot machine system that confers various bonuses, effects, and attacks based on the results, including how Zack levels up. The campaign is progressed through missions the player can select at their own pace, or complete side quests instead, traveling instantly to many fully 3D areas and dungeons with no need for an overworld map. The story only gets larger from here, so let's cut it down to size with a recapitation. The game begins with Zack Fair, Soldier 2nd Class of the group called Soldier, a private military army owned by the Shinra Electric Power Company in the city of Midgar. He completes a training exercise under the mentorship of his friend and commander, Angeal, a first-class soldier. Zack has tremendous skills and talent, but is unfortunately a little overconfident and reckless at times, as pointed out by his fellow soldier, another first-class named Sephiroth. Zack idolizes Sephiroth as a hero and aspires to one day be at his level, but he's not ready yet, despite this Sephiroth only being part of the training simulation. Angeal helps him out, reminding him to temper his aspirations with passionate dreams and steadfast honor. Zack hears from a fellow soldier of the mass desertion of troops in Soldier, and he's soon called in to speak with the director of Soldier, a man named Nilzard. He's briefed about Soldier First Class Genesis, who went missing during a mission in Wutai, an independent country to the west against whom Shinra Company is personally leveraging its military might. Zack is to pick up the mission in his place as a test for Soldier First Class per Angeal's recommended promotion. Angeal accompanies Zack on this mission as they are to bring down the last bastion for Wutai, and Shinra could complete its mission for economic world domination. Zack notes Angeal's massive sword, the Buster Sword, is rarely used, which Angeal jokingly admits he's rather stingy with, though does end up using it when his friend is in trouble. During the mission, he encounters Ifrit, and while he manages to just hold him off, he's amazed to be rescued by his idol, Sephiroth. Investigating some fallen troops that don't belong to Wutai, it's revealed they bear identical faces to Genesis, the missing soldier. Suddenly, Angeal goes missing, and Sephiroth suspects he too has betrayed them and deserted, though Zack fervently denies it. After the mission, Director Lazard confirms Angeal really is gone for unknown reasons, but assigns Zack on a new mission. He's to investigate what happened with two missing agents that went in to check around Genesis' hometown. In addition, he assigns Song, of the Turks, Shinra's elite operative and espionage unit, to cooperate on this mission. Heading to Benora Village, which was also Angeal's hometown, Zack finds and beats a few more Genesis clones. Song explains this technology was stolen from Shinra, which allowed Genesis to implant his abilities and strength on other soldier members or monsters. Originally, it was to clone their best soldiers to make up for the low numbers they currently have, but Zack is more keen to note that this infers that soldiers and monsters are fundamentally and biologically the same. Moving on, Song informs Zack that Angeal and Genesis were childhood best friends that grew up together, which is why Sephiroth thinks they are in cahoots with their desertion. Finding Angeal's mother, Jillian, she notes Zack is the restless puppy Angeal often spoke about, and she tells him Genesis came by a month ago with an army of minions and proceeded to start killing townsfolk. She also lets Zack know Angeal did come by here and left his prized sword behind, which she explains represents his family's honor. It turns out Genesis killed his parents, and Zack makes a plea to be given a chance to talk with Angeal and see about convincing him and Genesis to come back. Song sees now Zack's passion as why Sephiroth, who was originally assigned this mission but refused, chose Zack to take his place. He was actually counting on Zack to bring back Angeal and Genesis, his only friends in this world. They discover Genesis, but he beats them back and Angeal resurfaces. Zack discovers Angeal standing over a dead Jillian and is simply confused by the entire situation. Summoning Bahamut to distract and settle down a frustrated Zack, both Genesis and Angeal choose to turn their back on Shinra, while asking how long Zack himself can stand living on that side. Afterwards, Genesis reveals they are all monsters, quite literally, as he unveils a single large black wing. Proclaiming this means they have no honor or dreams anymore, he flies off. Refusing to believe that soldier means monster, Zack is interrupted as Shinra launches an airstrike to wipe the town of Benora off the map, ensuring no witnesses to this event. Soon after, Shinra wins the war with Wutai and has every city in the world under its thumb now. Time passes, and Zack is greeted by Sephiroth personally as he is promoted to Soldier First Class officially, though attaining this dream of his seems bittersweet. However, duty calls and he's assigned a new mission. After suiting up in his new black uniform, he's told a kill command has been issued for Angeal, Genesis, and their clone army. Unfortunately, Zack cannot be trusted due to his relationship to Angeal, and even Sephiroth holds his own thoughts on the issue. Suddenly, they're interrupted as the building is under attack, and Zack works alongside Turks, Reno, Rude, and Cisne as they take out more Genesis clones. Cisne encounters Genesis himself, but is soon overwhelmed, and Zack rescues her and weathers his punishing assault in a one-on-one duel. As he strikes down Genesis, he gets a call from Sephiroth, who's located Angeal. He tells Zack to hurry over before the Shinra army arrives so they can help their mutual friend escape, and Zack is happy to help. However, when he arrives and destroys a new monster, he's shocked to see it bears Angeal's face on it. As Sephiroth talks more with Zack, he elaborates more how Angeal, Genesis, and himself were close friends, and even though Sephiroth himself was the company's prized war hero, Genesis himself wanted such prestige as well. Even when they would train in the company's training room, Sephiroth could hold his own against both Angeal and Genesis. Though, when Genesis got serious, not even his friend Angeal could calm him down. Even then, Sephiroth was the better fighter, once injuring Genesis' pride even more than his blade. Surveying the monster, Sephiroth deduces the duo are in league with Dr. Hollander, which ties into the story he just told. At one time, the small wound Sephiroth dealt wasn't healing for some reason, and the doctor treating him was Dr. Hollander. He explains that some Mako energy infected the wound when it was dealt, and Angeal would have to be the donor in a transfusion. Sephiroth immediately questions why he was immediately rejected as a donor, but got no answer. Rather, he learned that Hollander was conducting an experiment on a soldier type G, in which monsters were to be made, but one failed experiment actually produced Genesis as a result. However, such an existence has proved to have side effects, such as his body rapidly degrading and the curious ability to make copies of himself. Hollander himself appears, surprised to see them, but explains only he can stop Genesis' degradation, after which Genesis himself appears and explains Hollander won't be captured. Genesis likens their situation to his favorite play, Loveless, and wonders which of the three friends would be the hero, to which he still envies Sephiroth. Meanwhile, Zack pursues Hollander, but Angeal himself interjects and shows him he too has become a monster with his own set of wings. Zack refuses to fight against Angeal, who is frustrated as his reality of being a monster is clashing with his principles and dreams, and Zack is sent tumbling down. When he comes to, Zack is in a church in the slums, where he's awoken up by Aerith, a young woman living there. He's immediately smitten with Aerith, asking her out on a date but getting quickly turned down. He's impressed by the rare sight of flowers in Midgar, suggesting she sell them and not only liven up Midgar with flowers, but also make a lot of money on the side. She still ends up spending the day with Zack, as at her favorite shop, Zack insists on getting her choice of a gift, resulting in Aerith picking out a large pink hair ribbon. She loves the gift, promising to wear it always, though as they're not officially a date continues, she questions the normalcy of members of soldiers. As rumor goes, they receive some sort of special surgery that turns them beyond human. She admits their lust for battle also makes them a bit frightening, and Zack chooses this time to confess he's with Soldier. She's naturally surprised and actually likes his unique eyes, to which Zack continues to flirt, showing off the trademark Mako-infused eyes of a soldier. Zack gets called back to Shinra, but succeeded in leaving a good impression on Aerith, and they agree to see each other again. En route back to Shinra, Angeal stops Zack again, this time more willing to talk. He asks for Zack's help as he's slowly losing his mind, and not only wants to keep his honor, but also wants Zack to help him defeat their enemies that are causing so much suffering. Zack agrees, but is swept away before he can ask further questions. He's delivered to Sephiroth, who's also helping Angeal, as they fight Genesis, whom they suspect is being used by Hollander to kill another notorious scientist within Shinra, Hojo. Meanwhile, Hojo sees through the power play when Genesis arrives, though Zack and Angeal are soon to arrive as well. Genesis retreats, but not before summoning Bahamut Fury for Zack to deal with. Later, Zack goes to visit Aerith when Song halts him to call him into a mission to Modeoheim, and gives Zack pause when he says he also knows Aerith, but won't elaborate. Genesis forces shoot down their helicopter, though Zack, Song, and a couple of common Shinra infantrymen manage to survive. They joke that Zack is a country boy from the sticks, so this harsh terrain won't bother him, though it turns out one of the grunts is as well. Zack is from the tiny village of Gongaga, and this village is from Nibelheim, who introduces himself as Cloud. As the mission for Hollander continues, Genesis moves to kill him, as he's already begun visibly degrading, and claims he doesn't need Hollander anymore. Zack saves Hollander, who beats away Cloud while trying to restrain him, and Zack duels once more with Genesis, proving he's a match against the degrading Ace, who is severely weakened and promises to end the world with his own miserable fate. On his way out, he is met by Angeal as well as Hollander, who explains the G in Project G was not for Genesis but for Jillian, who was Angeal's mother, who apparently took her own life earlier in Venora. The experiment was twofold. Jillian had Genova cells injected into her while she was pregnant with Angeal, and Genesis simply had Genova cells implanted directly into him as a test tube baby. What this resulted in was the failure Genesis, growing up strong but doomed to a short lifespan, while Angeal was perceived and born as a perfect specimen. Reason being, Angeal can use the Genova cells as a two-way conduit as intended. Angeal then explains his cells can absorb genetic traits and pass them to others, beyond what Genesis can manage, which is only imprint them onto others. Choosing to end his suffering by his own hands, Angeal casts away Hollander and absorbs a variety of monsters he created to help test and strengthen Zack. The resulting abomination slashes Zack cleanly on the cheek, and he is forced to kill the resulting mess that used to be his friend and mentor. After winning a bitter victory, a degrading Angeal is grateful that Zack ended him with dignity and honor. Before dying, he passes on his family sword and legacy of honor, the Buster Sword, to Zack. Even after returning to Midgar, Zack openly mourns the Aerith, with whom he's developed a much closer relationship, and has chosen to retain the scar Angeal gave him as a memento. Time passes as Zack and his hairstyle has matured, and he is no longer the young puppy he used to be, and is now a mentor himself to a new class of soldier rookies. Shinra sends him for some R&R at Costa del Sol, with Cisne watching over him. As it turns out, Director Lazard has since gone missing, and was secretly using company money to fuel Hollander's research. She teases him about his girlfriend Aerith, and explains she's under constant Turk surveillance as it turns out she is the last living member of a race called the Ancient. Zack is surprised not only to learn this, but also that Aerith never told him. Unexpectedly, Genesis copies attack from the sea, which can only mean Genesis is still around too. Song isn't so sure, and conjectures that since all souls return to the livestream, it's possible Genesis' soul is still able to control his copies from there as well. And so, Zack's vacation is over as the three of them are to investigate an attack on Junon. It turns out more Genesis clones were attacking, and this time Hollander was even there, though he gets away once again. Sephiroth comes by to greet Zack and questions if Genesis really did die. He deliberately drops that even the slums in Midgar are being attacked, encourages Zack to return there, and promises they'll meet again. Returning to Aerith, he finds a monster dog there, but it's not really causing problems, though Zack notes it's also an Angeal copy, and it seems keen to protect Aerith. However, it's weak due to degradation and chooses to rest in the rafters. Meanwhile, Zack builds Aerith a cart to sell flowers from, and has her give him a list of her wishes so he can do his best to make her happy. Unfortunately, an urgent mission comes up to separate their time together. Now, Sephiroth and Zack have been dispatched to come in after a monster outbreak near a rural Mako reactor that has even killed the soldier operatives there. Interestingly, these operatives were tracking the missing Lazard and reported a strange pod device similar to Hollander's, which means Lazard, Hollander, and Genesis might all be involved here. As their mission mentions nothing of their old friends, Sephiroth privately confesses to Zack that he's seriously considering leaving Shinra as well, depending on what happens in this mission. Before departing, Zack spends some precious time with Aerith, though Song is never far off. Song promises to protect Aerith as he's always done, and Zack sincerely thanks him as the only person he can rely on these days. Before the mission, Cloud turns out to be one of the three dispatched to him, and it turns out the reactor they must investigate is in Cloud's hometown of Nibelheim. As they arrive, Sephiroth makes small talk, asking Cloud how it feels to be home again, and trying to relate as he has no original town, and all he knows is his mother's name to be Genova, who died after he was born. In town, they are met by a local town girl by the name of Tifa. When Tifa learns he's a soldier first class, she seems surprised by the fact that they only sent him and Sephiroth, and begins to ask something else, but stops and runs off instead. As Sephiroth moves on to investigate, he tells Cloud he can visit his family while he's in town, and when Zack wonders why Cloud is hesitating and wearing his helmet and mask, he admits it's something embarrassingly personal. He later admits he was exaggerating and telling his friends back home that he was already a soldier first class, and is too ashamed to confront that lie now. Meanwhile, Sephiroth finds this whole area oddly familiar, and after they learn Tifa is to be their guide to the reactor, they pause to have a group photo taken. As Zack, Sephiroth, Tifa, and a hiding Cloud arrive at the reactor, Cloud is told to wait outside with Tifa and keep her safe. Within, Zack finds it interesting that the chamber to the reactor is also named the same as Sephiroth's mother, as the war hero Sephiroth identifies the cause of the reactor malfunction. Zack peers into one of the pods powering the plant and is shocked to find a monster within. Sephiroth explains that while the average soldier is a Mako-infused human, they are still simply stronger than normal humans. However, this thing has Mako levels exponentially higher than even a soldier. Sephiroth doesn't know what they are, beyond that they are abominations created by Dr. Hojo in his lab. Zack notes Sephiroth is well above average himself and asks if there is something more to that, and it triggers a splitting headache for Sephiroth. Sephiroth comes to a horrifying hypothesis that it's possible he was created the same way, and it becomes a crisis of identity ironically identical to his friends Genesis and Angeal. He admits he always knew he was unlike other children growing up, but could never place why, and doesn't want to think the reason could be that he's been the same as a monster. He questions his humanity when suddenly a sneak attack by Genesis knocks Zack back. Genesis swoops in to inform Sephiroth that of the three friends, he was the greatest monster to come out of the Jenova project, possibly due to having Hojo instead of Hollander managing him. Zack is more focused on the confirmed existence of Genesis, but he's ignored as Genesis continues to push Sephiroth with his past. He explains the Jenova projects were all projects involving usage of Jenova's cells. Jenova herself was excavated from a 2,000-year-old rock layer and is a true monster herself. Sephiroth is shocked again, yet Genesis continues, exposing the Jenova Project G created successes like Angeal and failures like himself, and Jenova Project S used the remains of every experiment thus far to create a perfect monster, Sephiroth himself. In addition, Sephiroth cannot copy or diffuse his genes, so he cannot degrade. He makes another plea for Sephiroth to share cells with him, and Sephiroth replies that regardless of anything he just said being true or not, he'll do the right thing and let the evil Genesis rot. However, Zack moves after Genesis but halts to save Tifa and a beaten Cloud from a monster. Afterwards, Cloud wishes he were strong like Zack, but Zack warns him not to get tangled up with Soldier. The next morning, Tifa informs Zack that Sephiroth is in the Shinra mansion, and Zack gets a phone call from Aerith, ending it with a promise to see her after a mission. Meanwhile, Sephiroth has found an old archive underneath the mansion, and within reads many reports on the Jenova project, learning information such as Jenova was also an ancient like Aerith. After waiting 7 days while Sephiroth reads non-stop, Zack comes out to discover Nibelheim is suddenly on fire with many townsfolk slain. Even Cloud is beaten once again, and around the corner is Sephiroth himself, calmly standing amidst the flames. Following him back to the reactor, Zack sees an injured Tifa within, hatefully cursing both Shinra and Soldier. Breaking through the door to Jenova, Zack sees Sephiroth beyond, unusually unsettled and talking strangely about going to the Promised Land together with his mother. Confronting Sephiroth, Zack is ignored as Sephiroth insists his mother, the Ancient, was the superior race and they should have ruled the planet. Somehow, humans stole that opportunity for sovereignty and hunted the Ancients to near extinction instead. Finally fed up with the crimes of humans, and Shinra in particular, Sephiroth sees what Angeal and Genesis kept warning about and chooses to stand alone. Embracing the fact that he was never human and thus doesn't have to pretend to be anymore, disgusted with Shinra's sick and twisted past of violating his mother, and accepting of being of the master race of ancients, Sephiroth severs all ties to Shinra, Soldier, and the human race. He tears away a mechanical facade to reveal a real Jenova who has been savagely mutilated and experimented on by Shinra and left to be a monstrous battery within this power plant. Zack still wants answers for the dead townsfolk and questions Sephiroth's sanity, but Sephiroth has no more words for any human, even if they used to be his allies. Feeling betrayed, Zack attacks Sephiroth, who parries him easily and knocks him to the depths of the reactor. As they clash, Zack remembers when Sephiroth was still the ideal hero and role model to him, once explaining that materia, which allows humans to use magic, is formed from condensed Mako energy from the planet and contains knowledge of the Ancients, who are bound to the planet and have the power to control it at will. Accusing Sephiroth of losing his way, he is countered by Sephiroth, who considers himself to be the Chosen One, despite being engineered by humans to be a Paragon Ancient to do their bidding. He intends to carry on what he feels is the right of the Ancients and rule this world, and take it back from power-hungry humans like the Shinra Corporation. Again, they clash, with Sephiroth clearly controlling the duel. Forced back, the Buster Sword is knocked from Zack's hand as Zack no longer has the energy to fight back. After the exhaustive fight, Sephiroth is fixated on liberating his mother and doesn't notice Cloud coming up behind him with Zack's sword and striking him with a sneak attack. Cloud then rushes to Tifa's side, but Sephiroth comes out bearing the head of Jenova and upset at Cloud's insulting strike. Zack urges Cloud to finish off an injured Sephiroth, but naturally, Cloud is nowhere near Sephiroth's league in terms of strength. However, Cloud makes up for it in sheer guts, as after Sephiroth impales him on his sword and issues a warning not to make him mad, Cloud instead uses all his strength to lift up Sephiroth, who's surprised by the feat, and hurl him away. Cloud succumbs to his injuries next to Zack, and as they both pass out, Dr. Hojo arrives on the scene and chooses Cloud to be his next test subject. The next thing he knows, a vision of Angeal wakes Zack up as he breaks out of his tank. Fighting disorientation, he gets Cloud out, but Cloud is stuck in a comatose state. After changing Cloud into a spare Soldier First Class uniform, Zack recalls Aerith's last letter for him, in which she wants to spend more time together, which prompts him to make his next destination back to Midgar. However, Shinra labels them both fugitive samples, so they find themselves now running from the army, and Cisne actually manages to catch up to them first. He pleads with her to just walk away as he knows it's a tall order to escape the Turks, but Cisne chooses her duty over personal feelings. However, Zack refuses to fight her seriously for now, and must leave her behind. Still, she follows them and empathizes with Cloud's severe case of Mako addiction, and so helps them this once to escape with their motorcycle. However, Genesis isn't done, as he interrupts their ride, seizing Zack and pulling out a bit of his hair. He knows they are Hojo's latest experiments, and modified versions of Genova's power runs through both of them. He has one of his clones eat his hair sample in order to gain the cells needed to cease his degradation, but all it does is mutate the clone into a gruesome monster. Later, Zack crosses by his hometown of Gongaga, but Cisne is there and warns him the Turks already expected him to visit his parents, though they are also hunting for Angeal in the area, who reportedly was sighted in Shinra's lab. She's watching over his family for him and teases that his parents have already asked her to join the family. Zack notes something like Angeal was also nearby but flies away again, and later he is surprised to find Dr. Hollander and Genesis himself. It turns out that after the Doctor nearly died by the hand of Genesis, he used his cells to stay alive and despite degrading on borrowed time, is looking for a cure for that now. Genesis believes a pure S cell sample will stop their degradation, and only Cloud and Zack bear those right now. Hollander makes a grab for Cloud, but Zack puts an end to the Doctor once and for all, with a little help from former director Lazard. He's white-winged and degrading like Angeal with his exact face, precisely because he's been turned into an Angeal copy by his own doing. While the real Angeal really is dead, Lazard finds himself with Angeal's will to save Zack and others, which means they must stop Genesis once and for all. Almost to Midgar, Zack stops to finally confront the failed and tortured creation of a Genova-infused human, who considers Zack a perfect fusion of Angeal's will and Sephiroth's superior cells. Behind him is a statue to the goddess Minerva, as well as a massive materia he claims will return everyone to the lifestream. Zack attempts to calm Genesis down and try to help him regain his humanity, but Genesis chooses to use the materia's power to transform into a massive armored monster. Zack wins over this form, reverting Genesis to his original form once more, who is now cured of his degradation thanks to the materia. Zack sees no reason to fight now, but Genesis still insists, and Zack is frustrated that once again, he has to shoulder a burden forced upon him. Clashing one final time, he knocks Genesis back, who, for an instant, turns around and sees the goddess Minerva as he always imagined, just before falling for good in the livestream, signifying his final defeat. Still honorable, Zack carries a still-breathing Genesis and lays him to rest beside Cloud and an injured Lazard. Lazard says the winged Angeal copy from before protected Cloud from Shinra earlier, but it's too late as the final copies of Angeal die and return to the livestream, leaving Zack as his only living legacy. The winged dog also had a letter for Zack in its possession, which Zack reads. It turns out it's from Aerith, and it's apparently been 4 years since their last meeting, and this has been the 89th unrequited letter she sent him. She mentions her flower sales are doing well these days, and despite her feelings for him, this would be her final letter to him. Naturally, Zack is upset to learn he's been unconscious for 4 years, but still wants to be with Aerith and make things right despite his unintended absence. Carrying Cloud, he has every intention to get back to Midgar, save Cloud, and reunite with Aerith. After leaving Genesis to rest, Genesis is soon snatched away by 2 mysterious soldiers first class, Nero and Weiss, who seek to recruit Genesis into their organization of Deep Ground, preceding events to be played out in a feature game, Dirge of Cerberus. Meanwhile, Song orders Cisne and the other Turks to find and save Zack before the army finds them, which Cisne is very motivated to do. Though this is a near treasonous action, Song is willing to risk it for his friend and for Aerith's sake. At the same time, Zack and Cloud are in the back of a pickup truck just outside Midgar, and even the Turks are having a hard time finding them now. Unfortunately, the army intercepts Zack first, and Zack willingly chooses to fight and honorably protect Cloud, despite his own desire to return to Aerith and save himself. Cloud only now begins to wake up out of his Mako poisoning as Zack walks out to face down literally hundreds upon hundreds of Shinra troops and attack helicopters. Commenting that the price of freedom is steep, Zack gives a final salute and promises to protect his honor, as he takes on Shinra's military single-handedly. As he stands strong against thousands of blades, bullets, and missiles, Zack is pushed to his limit as he recalls the bonds he held precious in life. Starting with his close friends within Shinra, he fondly recalls his former heroic idol, Sephiroth, and Turks, Cisne and Song. Then finally, his closest bonds, those of his friend and mentor Angeal, the aspiring infantryman Cloud, and his love interest Aerith. Against all odds, Zack triumphs in his final stand, but he is on his last legs as Shinra begins reinforcing their troops, firing countless bullets into a relentless Zack. Eventually, enough is enough as he cannot overcome his wounds anymore, and after some nameless infantryman puts a final bullet into his head, Zack, the rising star of Soldier First Class, with dreams of heroism despite being dragged into so many outside messes, tragically falls with thoughts of Aerith to carry him into his final moments. As the game concludes, Aerith notes the sudden rain and seems to sense something wrong. Meanwhile, Cloud finally wakes up and drags himself over to Zack, who is still barely alive, and forces a smile for him and urges Cloud to live on in his stead as his own living legacy. Passing the Buster Sword onto Cloud, he also passes on his dream of being a hero for Cloud to fulfill. Cloud acknowledges the passing of the torch, and Zack honorably dies, though with a smile on his face. Cloud thanks him and promises not to forget and walks away, leaving Zack's body behind. Joining the livestream, Zack is greeted by his friend Angeal, who finally now is able to rest in peace. As the game ends, the trauma of the events unfortunately resulted in Cloud blocking all memory of Zack despite his promise. His delirium actually has him believing he is Zack in all but name, as the game leads up to the original installment, Final Fantasy VII. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII has enjoyed the success of selling over 6.5 million copies worldwide.